All right, everybody, welcome to this impromptu seminar, mostly organized by Martin. So thanks a lot, Martin, for doing it. We will just enjoying it. So Misha Schiffman doesn't need any introduction for the members of School of Physics and Astronomy, of course. But since we're in Zoom, I see already 70 people there. So just for the benefit of our guests, Misha is a prominent theoretical physicist. His expertise is mostly in high energy physics, quantum chromodynamics, supersymmetric field theories, and he has a marvelous achievements in all of these fields. He is an elected member of National Academy of Sciences, and he's awarded a number of most prestigious prizes like Dirac Medal and Sakurai Award and others. I will not try to list all of them. In addition to that, Misha is a historian of science, probably by now is a professional historian of science. And he mostly focuses on the 20th century period between the wars, where two great things happened almost simultaneously. Great discoveries in physics and rise of great tyrannical regimes in Europe. And today, Misha will tell us how these two notable events interacted with each other. And probably history continues to these days. All right, okay. Misha, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I should say that my today's lecture is due to Martin's initiative, and I'm very happy for this occasion extended to me. So this, in a sense, can be viewed as a continuation of my previous lecture, where I described mostly what was going on with the quantum physics from its very inception, by the patriarch of this science, like Einstein, like Becquerel, or Planck himself. Now I will move on to the point in time where the patriarchs did what they were supposed to do. They made their breakthrough, and now an army of young researchers, young, vigorous, and ambitious, and happy to live in the era of new science, which is always fruitful time for young people. They started working on this. They started building their careers around quantum physics with new discoveries, new challenges, and remarkable progress at the very end. So unfortunately, the timing was not so good for them. Here I will show you the patriarch. As you know, that the very term quantum was introduced by Max Planck. He was professor at the University of Berlin, and he introduced the concept of a quantum of light in a report to the German Physical Society when he tried to explain the black body radiation. It was measured to relatively high precision, and old theory, not based on quantum mechanics, miserably failed. In order to amend or to fix this failure, Planck first invented that the light is emitted not continuously but in a quantum manner. Okay, then another patriarch is Niels Bohr, of course. Here I showed you this picture last time. Here's shortly after his marriage with his wife, Margaret. And he, together with Sommerfeld, explained one of the perennial paradoxes of classical physics, namely why all the atoms are stable. According to the classical physics, they should collapse in a relatively fast time, but that never happened. So Bohr invented quasi-classical quantization of the orbits. He started with the hydrogen atom, but then extended it to all other atoms. That was another great breakthrough, which was marked by Nobel Prize awarded to Bohr in 1922. So you see, he indeed was a patriarch, but not only by his role in the discoveries, but by his enormous and unique role in how he treated young people and how he taught them quantum physics, inspired them, took care of them, and created sort of a very special atmosphere around himself where young people flourished. As we all know, and I mentioned it the last time, that his laboratory in Copenhagen, which was donated to him by a beer producer, I forgot his name, major beer producer in Denmark. He built his house and the laboratory and donated to Bohr, and it became the major mecca for young quantum physicists as of early 1920s.
It was Carlsberg beer. Carlsberg.
Carlsberg. Yeah, you are absolutely right. It was Carlsberg. By the way, he still also, it's a, maybe, I don't know, I make this remark. He made a pipe from the Carlsberg breweries directly to the house of Niels Bohr. So instead of water in this pipeline, he could get a supply of beer how much he wanted. You know, now this house is sometimes given to the guests of honor of the Bohr Institute of Physics, and the privilege is extended to them too. So it never stopped. So this Nobel Prize probably signified or was the end of the old quantum, so-called old quantum mechanics. And since that time, it was driven mainly by newcomers, by younger people who were born in the beginning of the 20th century, but not in the end of the 19th century. For instance, the major two contributors were Werner Heisenberg, who was born in 1901, and then, Schrödinger was born in 1887, so he was, in age, he was older, significantly older than Heisenberg, but he didn't spend all time doing physics, and also he had problems with TB and spent many times in tuberculosis sanatoria in Switzerland and Austria. So he did, I mean, if you count the hours he spent to physics, he spent in doing physics, he is comparable to Heisenberg. Their works were breakthrough great works on the creation of quantum mechanics, the so-called matrix mechanics, is 1925, during a vacation on the island of Helgoland. And which is now it's more convenient for quantum mechanics, Schrödinger's approach, which is usually used by students all over the world. The work was done in January 96, or published in January 96. It was written during his stay in tuberculosis sanatorium in Switzerland, working on his equations. Okay, the other two people who were very important in the early ages of quantum mechanics is Paul Dirac, who wrote a Schrödinger equation in the relativistic limit, the so-called Dirac equation, and also Wolfgang Pauli. He was born in 1900. You see, all of them were contemporaries. And in 1927, he discovered the exclusion principle, which is a basic principle which explains why heavy atoms exist and why electrons on the orbit don't crash into each other. The famous exclusion Pauli principle. By the way, he was discovered it on working on a very narrow problem, practical problem, some so-called anomalous Zeeman effect, but it's not important. What is important that he, out of this very narrow subject, he could extract a very general conclusion. Okay, Now, since 1927, there was a powerful wave of applications which began being studied, which were under development. One of the first of them was George Gamow's suggestions that alpha decays of radioactivity, alpha decays, is in fact a tunneling process which is predicted and could be explained only exclusively as a quantum mechanical effects. There is no analog of the tunneling processes in classical physics. At that time, he was also very young. He was he was a Russian physicist. He was on a scientific trip to Copenhagen on the grant of the Rockefeller Foundation, of which I will say shortly later. After this work, he became instantly famous. Then the grant ended and he returned to Russia. And when he returned to Russia, he, with great surprise, discovered that this couple of years that he was absent, the political situation became much, much worse than at the time he left it. And he was not allowed to go even to conferences, let alone for collaborations. And he realized that something bad is going to happen to him. His father was a very distinguished cleric, a Russian Orthodox priest of in a high position. Immediately after Bolshevik came to power, he was persecuted and deprived of all means of survival. So George Gamow realized that he will be probably arrested, and he escaped. Eventually, after many attempts, he escaped to the West. Houtermans, another character on my narrative, also a very young man. He was born, I believe, in 1904 or 1905. He was the first to say something about about why stars emit light and heat. He was the first to say that the stellar reactions which feed all stars are thermonuclear reaction of nuclei fusions. The first paper on that was in 1929. He made it after lots of conversations with George Gamow and in collaboration with Robert Atkinson, who was a British astronomer. Hans Bethe later, maybe 10 years or so, he, at the time when Houtermans was working, there was very few data about nuclei. Not even neutron was discovered, so he couldn't develop fully quantitative theory. This theory was completed by Hans Bethe, another refugee from Europe, another Nobel Prize winner in 1939. Finally, Rudolf Peierls, who was Pauli's assistant at that time, in 1930 started the theory of condensed matter. In particular, he made a very crucial work in the Ising. Well, Americans pronounce Ising. In fact, since he was German, the right pronunciation is his name is Ising, and he was the first to show the existence of the phase transition in two-dimensional Ising model. Pauli used to say that, or to joke that I invented quantum condensed matter, but I hate it. But I am very gracious or tolerant. I allowed my assistants, if they want, to do condensed matter. So he didn't object against Pauli working on condensed matter, and that was his main subject during the years he was an assistant. Okay. Another thing I want to mention that the quantum chemistry was born at this time. Heitler and London explained chemically the hydrogen molecule. Then there's Thomas and Fermi approximation, Hartree-Fock, John Slater, Linus Pauling, and valence bond model, molecular orbitals, and then Hans Hellmann, of whom I will speak today a little bit with some detail. I might just tell you why I came to this subject. When I was a student, I was in the course of quantum mechanics, they teach to Hellmann-Feynman formula, which tells us how the energy levels of any quantum mechanical system depends on parameters if the Hamiltonian depends on parameter. Of course, nobody knows Feynman, so no question. I knew about him, but when I started asking my teachers who is Hellmann, whose name is the first in such an important formula, nobody knew. Much later, I asked about him in the West, and also nobody knew. So I will tell you will try to tell you a few words later on about Hellmann. His story is very tragic. This is a photograph of the Göttingen University, where many great physicists who were at the helm of nascent quantum mechanics, they worked in Göttingen University. Not only theorists, not only physicists, theoretical physicists, but only mathematicians. For instance, Richard Courant, who was the father of our university, Hans Courant, worked at Göttingen University, and he was evicted from there in 1933 when Nazi took the power in their hands. You see what a beautiful building. It is a small university. Now you will never hear about this university if you are interested in exact sciences. Nobody left there to do any exact scientist, and university is not the walls, you know, it's the people who work there. Okay, now I come to a brief discussion of the social and political background in Europe at that time. First of all, I want to remind you that in the 1920s, early 1930s, Germany not yet recovered after its defeat, crushing defeat in World War I, was in very bad economic shape. Inflation was galloping. During Weimar Republic, inflation was galloping. It was at the level of 100% or more weekly. Not yearly, but weekly 100%. So people would specifically get a salary, and if they don't trade their money for some goods the very same day, or maybe the very same hour, next day it will be twice or 3 times cheaper, and they could buy much, much less. Here you see at the end of this, in the 1930s, people in Germany used the money. They were so useless that they used the money to heat their rooms by burning the money. You know, the prices were in billion Deutsche Marks. First they were in million Deutsche Marks, but then eventually they come, like now in Zimbabwe. You know, Zimbabwe recently had billion Zimbabwean dollars in circulation. Now they get rid of their own dollars and use either South African currency or American dollars, because it was not possible they didn't have time to print new banknotes. So high was their inflation. Now, the second element of the economic situation was the Great Depression that started in the US after a major fall on stock market. It was around September 4th, 1929. A few months later, the Great Depression spread all over the world like a fire. Many businesses, because lots of banks failed, then subsequently many businesses failed, a lot of unemployed, the gross national product went down exponentially, So it was a very terrible, of course, inflation in Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when it accelerated because of the Great Depression. Politically, in 1922, Mussolini already established a fascist regime in Italy. That is called the prelude to Hitler's regime. He was legally elected as a prime minister of Italy. He was a journalist who started with a small radical party, but because of the bad situation in Italy, Italy also was defeated in the First World War. The party became popular. He won. It won a victory. He was elected legally as a prime minister. But a few years after his election, he became an absolute dictator. All parties were forbidden. Parliament became nothing. It's just a toy, ridiculous toy. Strict censorship was established in the press and in media. He started talking about spazio vitale. It's the same as Lebensraum in German, living space. So Hitler borrowed from him the myth that their nation has not enough living space and should be allowed to expand the way they want. Now, this is in the western part of the Europe. Now, what was going on in the Soviet Union? As you certainly know, in 1917, there was a coup d'etat, a very small radical left-wing party of the Bolshevik, Marxist Bolshevik communists used the opportunity to grab the power, and they immediately started eliminating opponents, not just, metaphorically speaking, eliminating, just physically eliminating, killing, forcing out of the country, expropriating all property without any limitations. So, of course, people were unhappy, and even there were uprisals, rebellions. Even the Navy people who helped Bolsheviks to come to power in 1917 very soon start feeling regret about this absolute power they accumulated and rebelled against Bolshevik. So I will say a few words about this later. Now, in 1930s in Germany, there began an obvious rise of NSDAP. Usually in America, they abbreviate this as the Nazi Party, but in fact, its full name, National Socialist German Workers' Party. So it was called Socialist and Workers' Party, and not surprisingly, because Hitler played in a game. The life of ordinary people was very hard in Germany because of this terrible inflation, and he promised to workers that he will fix the problems. First of all, unemployment, and second, the nation felt humiliated because of such a terrible defeat in the First World War and very hard conditions imposed on them by the victorious parties. They were not allowed to have any armaments, to have arms, to do what they want, and they had to pay it. In addition to economic crisis, they had to pay contributions to England and France. So he promised an improvement, and indeed, I should say that in this respect, an improvement came when he was elected a Chancellor of Germany, or Prime Minister. In 1932, in January 1933, there was a general election. Hitler's party, NSDAP, came first, but they didn't have an absolute majority in the parliament. The left parties, communist and socialist, if they could unite together, they had the majority in the parliament, and they wanted to do so, but their unification was forbidden from Moscow by Stalin, who was who was considering himself the leader of all communists in the world. So for him, having a union with socialists was worse than anything else. So this idea failed. The president of Germany in January 1933 nominated Hitler as the prime minister of the country. Very shortly after that, after some provocations with the parliament building, Hitler banned all political parties except his party, and started issuing executive orders and new laws one by one very quickly. For instance, already by summer 1933, all Jews were banned from the government positions. They have to be fired. 2 years later, they had to be fired by all positions, even in private. 3 years later, even in private business or institutions. So racial laws was enacted, anti-socialist, lots of other laws which eventually brought the disaster to Europe. Also, 1937, you see, 4 years after Hitler, there was a start of Great Terror of Soviet Union. It didn't come out of blue. The whole idea under the Bolshevik coup d'etat in 1917 was the idea of hatred. Here I will show you something. You see this picture, if you see, look, it's picture made in 1918, so a few months after the coup d'etat. You see here people which look by that time, by the times I describe here, well-dressed. They are not some homeless people or something else, and they carry a huge poster which says "Death to bourgeoisie and their lackeys. Long live Red Terror." So presumably this was some meeting of the ruling party in the country, and that's what they want. They wanted Red Terror right away. So if you ask me what's the difference between NSDAP and Bolsheviks, between Hitler's ideas and ideas in the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia at that time, I would answer there was no difference whatsoever, only verbal differences. Indeed, both ideologies were telling people not to look at others on individual grounds, not to judge others on their merits and deeds, but to divide the society in several classes or groups, and people who belong to some classes were by default to be taken as the best people, the good people, trustable people who could never do something bad, and people from the other classes are bad people, evildoers, who are guilty for all ills of the society, and they have to be exterminated, not metaphorically exterminated, not just suppressed or persecuted, and not even prosecuted, but just killed, with no laws. No laws apply. Bolsheviks used to say, we are not bound to any laws. We do the laws. We make the laws on the basis of our consciousness. Okay, so the only difference was that in Germany, it was Aryans versus Jews and other areas. The first were angels, and the second group of the people, they were criminals who were supposed to be physically eliminated. In Russia, the society was divided in a slightly different way. There were poor people, in particular workers and poor peasants, versus bourgeoisie, which means property owners. In America, they don't use very often the term bourgeoisie, but basically, if I would like to translate it modern American, it's middle class people who have some property, maybe houses for to rent, or maybe even factories, you know, dealerships, something. And the first group, no matter who you are, maybe a thief or a murderer, if you belong to the first group, you are an angel, all roads are open to them. If you belong to the second group, your life is very close to be finished. So, so let me explain to you, you know, another difference was formal, because Germans are very scrupulous, meticulous, and methodical people. And in Russia, there is much more chaos, and therefore who belonged to this bourgeoisie was not strictly defined. So the red commissars in regions, they defined by themselves who were bourgeoisie. And then I can give you an example on, as an example, I can give you the story of my own grandfather, who was born, 1980s, early 1880s. And he was from a very poor family, and the only source of his only living was due to the fact that he owned a Singer sewing machine. Okay, he was a tailor, self-employed tailor in some small town in the western part of the country, and he was tailoring for people. Everybody was happy. He never had any help, any hand from the outside. 4 children, his wife never worked, you know. In fact, she was illiterate. She couldn't even write or read. Very, very poor. He told me about his story of his employment. However, because due to the fact that he owned this sewing machine twice in the 1920s and then in the 1930s, he was extremely close to arrest and further gulag probably. Each time he just flew with his family, wife and 4 children. He managed to escape through a flight at night, you know, secretly to a different, very distant part of the country. So he was in the list of bourgeois elements. In this small town, first in one town and then in the other, who at the very end, in late 1930s, he hid his sewing machine and went to work for a factory. So then he was okay. He was qualified as a worker, not as a bourgeois element. Okay, now these 2 slides, with these 2 pictures which I see, they refer not to the 1920s, but to the already 1930s, when Stalin consolidated his power to extreme. Here you see a memorial stone from a firing, from a shooting range near Moscow in Butovo, which was used as a place for firing squads to shoot people. I wouldn't even say political prisoners. Everyone was a prisoner of the regime at that time. It says that from August 8, 1937 till to October 19, 1933, so 14 months, you see 20,762 people were shot by firing squads on this firing range in Butovo. Can you imagine 20,000 people for in a year? And it was only one place, one shooting range. In fact, they used, even in Moscow, there were quite a number of them, but if you count how many of them were in the entire country, they would be probably counted in thousands. Here is a picture. You see a painting which was drawn by one of the people who was shot there but survived after all. And many years later, he drew how you see people were brought by trucks there and immediately shoot, and there was a big ravine and they fell there, and that's all. That was the end. Now, okay, I have to go faster, but just a few words from this slide. The Red Terror, of which I told in Soviet Union, was announced on September 5th, 1918, less than a year after the coup d'etat in 1917. It was an executive order from Lenin on the Red Terror, and it empowered CHK, which is predecessor of KGB, to extrajudicial process, taking hostages and enforce them. So all even remnants of the laws were abandoned at that time. So in the first wave of the Red Terror, thousands of people were executed on the charges of belonging to counter-revolutionary classes or social movements. Among these victims were landlords, clergy, imperial army officers and their families, members of all political parties other than the Communist Party. So basically all educated people. Some of them managed to escape abroad. About 2 million people were forced out of the country. So now with this environment around, you can see what people, what Western intelligentsia in Europe saw on one side and on the other side. On one side, which they could easily see, there was a terribly atrocious Nazi regime in Germany. Here you see, for instance, a cartoon on Einstein from Deutsche Tageszeitung, daily paper, April 1st, 1933. And it was quite visible because Germany was quite close to other countries of the Western Europe. So here in the academic world, here you see some data. After 1933, 1,100 of 7,700 of senior German university professors left or lost their jobs for racial and or political reasons. About 550 fled the country. Those who didn't fled were eventually sent to Auschwitz and other concentration camp. So this they saw on one side. On the other side, they knew, you know, from political propaganda, they thought that they knew that there is a wonderful country which builds a radiant future, a paradise future for the workers and peasants. Because, you know, equality, you know, or equalizing everybody was always emphasized, and how nice people would live, friendly, prosperous, and so on. Of course, under the situation, most of the Western intelligentsia despised and hated Hitler, and that certainly was correct, but they also very, very sympathetic to the communist regime in Russia. And the rest of my story, of my talk, will tell you some stories, what this sympathy led to. First, the last transparency bit for the stories, I wanted to remind you how young physicists were job hunting after PhD at that time. It was extremely difficult to find a job. Postdoctoral positions funded from the grants were non-existent. Research state funds non-existent. No financial support from University of departments. The only option was becoming an assistant to an established professor, going into vassalage in this way, somewhat analogous to teaching assistant today. But this professor should be influential enough in order to be able to get money for an assistant. Low-level professors, unknown professors couldn't hire an assistant. They didn't have money for that. So a few were supported by relatives. One of such person, for instance, is George Plachek, of whom I want to tell you his dynamical story, but probably I won't have time. Now, the only support at that time for quantum physicists and molecular biologists came from the Rockefeller Foundation of New York. It was the only private fund in the world who would support by a deliberate decision young quantum physicists and molecular biologists. Virtually all physicists of this generation who won the Nobel Prize or otherwise were famous, even without a Nobel Prize, they were the recipients of the Rockefeller stipend. Unfortunately, it was given only for, it could be given only for 1 year. It couldn't be extended even for the second year. This foundation still exists and it's rather rich, but they shifted their supports completely from physics or molecular biology to ecological research. If you want to do research in ecology, you can apply there for a generous fellowship. The only other organization to help, you know, the flood of refugees, which flying, escaping from Germany, was the so-called Academic Assistant Council, which in '93 was established in the United Kingdom through the donations of private people, with the Rutherford as the president. It was providing stipends first for young physicists from Germany, and Germany at that time was the most scientific country in the world. If you remember, German language was like Latin in the Middle Ages, like English now. It was the language of science. All papers had to be printed has to be released in German. And of course, because of a large number of fleeing Jews and leftists from Germany, they needed support the most. So at first, this AAC supported only refugees from Germany, but then from other places, as other places of Europe became vulnerable to the Nazis, they started supporting other scientists. Their standard stipend would be 200 pounds sterling per year, which at that time was money sufficient for survival in Great Britain. I tried to translate it into modern US dollars and came up with something like $1,500 per month. It's very hard to translate because unlike in the US, inflation in Great Britain was not always properly accounted for. Okay. This I will skip. This I will skip probably. And now I begin my stories of specific people. You see here the same Hans Hellmann, whom I have already mentioned, the second author of the Hellmann-Feynman formula. He was the first to publish a huge monograph, a textbook, or rather monograph on quantum chemistry, which was published in 1936 in Russian and in 1937 in Vienna. Here you see the cover of the modern edition. It was published a few years before Linus Pauling published his book. I'm sorry I misspelled here the name of Pauling. And here is his formula. You see the derivative of the parameter is expressed as the expectation value of the given over the given state. This is a remark for physicists, but it's an important formula just for everybody. Now, what happened to him? He was a professor at the university. He graduated from Stuttgart, Kiel universities, and later worked at Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry in Berlin under Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner. I will speak about Lise Meitner later on. He got his PhD at Stuttgart with Professor Erich Regener. There he met his future wife, Victoria Bernstein, who was the foster daughter of the Regener's family. Her origin, she was Jewish from Ukraine, and she was a niece of Regener's wife. So they met first in the house of the Regeners in 1929. They were married shortly after that, and then Hans Hellman Jr. was born, and Hellman became a docent in Hanover. Docent is like as associate professor in the United States. There he started his work of quantum chemistry, issued very quickly 2 papers on covalent bonds. However, in June 1933, the second Reichsel law was issued by the Nazi regime, and he lost his job. He was told, by the way, not just he lost his job, but he was summoned to the top university bosses. He was a pure German, but his wife was Jewish, so he was summoned and was told that if he divorced his wife, he might be okay, he could stay at the university, but he declined this proposition right away. Here you see a quotation from a memoir of his son who miraculously survived. So he had a few offers, not very brilliant, but still one of the offers came from an American college, but he accepted the offer which seemed to him very lucrative, namely he was offered the position of head of the quantum theory group at Karpov Institute of Physical Chemistry in Moscow. This was a huge institute and they didn't have anything in quantum theory, so they decided to start a group. They also offer a very competitive salary and free housing. And the third factor, no, there were more 2 factors why he accepted, is that his wife had some distant relatives in Russia, and also he had some left-leaning persuasions. So he accepted, came to Russia, got settled there. Here you see him in a Russian apartment. And the years 1934-38 were the years of his very rapid scientific advancement. He had a number of graduate students. In this, 3 years, he published 20 original papers and wrote the first monograph on quantum chemistry, which I have already mentioned. Okay. So here is something about what exactly he do, but maybe it's not important. In 1935, he received full professorship from the Karpov Institute. However, in March 1938, at the peak of the Great Terror, he was arrested. Here is how his son writes about this. At night, they woke me up. 2 men were looking for something in my children's bed, and about an hour later, my father was taken away and I was not destined to see him again. That happens on March 9th. The mother's attempts to find out anything about the fate of my father was unsuccessful. She was denied everything, and once the NKVD said, if you come again, we will arrest you and send your child to an orphanage. orphanage. And indeed, they made good on their promise. Sometimes later, Frau Hellman, well, Hellman himself was accused of espionage for Germany, and the May of the same year executed. Okay. There was, I looked, by the way, now it is possible to see some archive materials. It was possible in the 90s, now it's less possible, but still I saw in some book file about Hellman, and there was written there's no material evidence in this case. So he was accused of something terrible with no material evidence, but this was normal at that time. Victoria Hellman was arrested later, sent to a special Gulag camp for the wives of the enemies of the people. Their son was sent to a special orphanage for the children of the enemies of the people. However, Hans Jr., he was 12 at that time, was a very smart boy, and he managed to escape from the orphanage, which was like a prison for young people, and made his way to distant relatives of his mother in Kharkov. They managed to forge completely new documents for the boy with a different name and patronymic and another completely sounding Russian surname. Hans Hellman Jr. became Gennady Minchin. So they lived in complete terror for many years, at least for 20 years, till Khrushchev came to power, that they will be found, criminals because of this, but they managed to save life for Hans Hellman Jr. He became one of anonymous, the Hellman Hans Henner Sr. became one of anonymous known person. He was forgotten in the West. Nobody knew who was Feynman's co-author. Only in the late 80s, under Gorbachev, a former great student of Hellman, or few students, published their recollections, and so did his son, who eventually in the 1990s made his way to Germany and recovered his name at birth. That's the story of one of the sympathizers who believed into this propaganda. But I want to be impartial, and now I will show, okay, before I go to something else, and I have only 7 minutes, I will show, okay, this I have already shown to you, and these two. And now I want to tell you the story of Liz Meitner. She was an incredible woman, one of a very few female scientists in nuclear physics. And she was among the few, very few, I think she was the second student who was allowed to enroll in the University of Vienna in physics department. The second student, because it's forbidden, it was forbidden to educate women at that time at Vienna University. So she worked, in 1906, she received her PhD and soon after moved to Berlin, the capital of Germany, where she worked with Otto Hahn for 31 years in Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Kaiser Wilhelm Institute is the analog of, there are many of them. It's the analog of the present day Max Planck Institutes, which are scattered all over Germany. She worked in this institute of, I think it was devoted to physical chemistry. From 2006 to 1913, she worked for free as a private guest. She got no salary at all. Hahn was a chemist, and Liz's influence shifted them both to radioactive isotopes. She pressed very hard. At that time, radioactive isotope was a hot topic, and she was trying to convince Otto Hahn, who was the head of the laboratory, to start doing experiment and theoretical research on radioactivity. In 1934, Lise Meitner persuaded Otto Hahn to organize a special group for neutron radiation of uranium and study the resulting product. Meitner, Hahn, and Strassman, a young assistant to Hahn, quickly repeated Fermi. I want to say, before that, Fermi in Rome made some experiments with neutron radiation of uranium. You see, the great Fermi. And he got some results. The results were correct, but he interpreted them totally wrong. He interpreted them as a creation of trans-uranium elements after neutron radiation. So according to his view, which was prevalent at that time, neutrons got captured in uranium and created heavier steel nuclei. Nevertheless, he got 1938 Nobel Prize for these experiments, which they are proven to be wrong by Lise Meitner, Hahn, and Strassman. And this was a very lucky experience. Maybe I will tell you, I still have only 5 minutes. Very luckily that he got the Nobel Prize because this helped him to escape from Europe. So what exactly, here it is written, I won't repeat it. So by 1938, Meitner, Hahn, and Strassman have published a dozen of articles supporting the transuranium Fermi's hypothesis. Okay, so they believed in that. However, in a little bit later, they started getting very strange results. Something was bothering Lise, because after irradiation of uranium targets, the product contained, some of the products contain chemical elements lighter, not heavier, but lighter than uranium. And they didn't understand where they could come from. In early July 1938, Otto Hahn informed Lise that he had again carefully analyzed the products of the previous experiment and found 3 substances chemically behaving as radium, atomic number 88, E, that is 4 atomic units below uranium, and asked her what to do next and what does it mean. However, unfortunately, Lise didn't have time to answer. A disaster occurred. That's because Hitler, in spring 1938, Hitler occupied Austria. You see, Austria, so-called Anschluss. Austria became a part of Germany, and all Austrians became automatically German citizens with all the consequences. Namely, German laws were now applicable to them too. Meitner, who stayed in Germany as long as she could, and why she could stay in Germany till 1938? Because Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was a private institute. It was not a state-owned institute, and that's why she was screened from all racial laws until she became German. And this happens in the summer of 1938. Meitner dossier came to the attention of Heinrich Himmler, number 2 in the Hitler's hierarchy, who wrote, "To be fired, but not allowed to leave Germany. Highly undesirable let famous Jews to leave Germany. They should not be able to speak abroad about their attitude towards Germany." So her situation, she became known of this outcome in late June 1938. So a concentration camp became virtually imminent because this, what writings of Heinrich Himmler basically forbade, was banned for leaving the country. No legal immigration for her was possible at that time. It was too late. She was started panicking, by the way. Niels Bohr immediately called his Dutch colleague Dirk Koster and asked him, what can we do for Liz? Koster took up her entry visa to Holland. He said he promised Bohr to get a visa for Liz Meitner, but she had to leave permission to had to leave Germany without permission, illegally. In Berlin, only Otto Hahn and Springer scientific advisor Paul Rosbaud were initiated and knew about the plan of escape. By the way, Paul Rosbaud was a German who hated Germany and stayed in Nazi Germany. In fact, he was an agent of the British Secret Services, and he was during all the war, he was transmitting secret information to London. He was the first to find out about the German advances in rocket technology in a laboratory in Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea. So they would know what to bomb. So the secret nature of the forthcoming escape only increased Liz's nervous tension. She was devastated and close to collapse. So Koster arrived in Berlin on July 11th in the evening. The next day, Rosbaud drove Liz to the train station. Already on the platform, fear totally paralyzed her. She couldn't make a step. She clung to Rosbaud and begged him to take her back home. Rosbaud reviewed. Koster was waiting for Liz on the train. They greeted each other as if they had met by chance. At 6 p.m., everything went smoothly. They were not questioned by the police guards. And already at 6 p.m., they were in the Dutch territory in Groningen. The relief from the successful escape turned Liz into shock. She was in shock for a few days. She was over 60 at that time and had to start life from scratch. Uprooted from usual routine, cut off from the work, friends' native language, and sources of income. Liz became a stateless person without a passport, without a roof over her head, completely alone. She had no very close family. Okay, meanwhile, to end the story, what happened? Hahn was going on with new experiments to see what about the lighter than uranium elements in the residue, so after irradiation. In November, he illegally visited Denmark, secretly visited Denmark, and Liz came there too in order to cooperate their effort, in order to write down an outline of what's next to do. From the Netherlands, she managed to go to Sweden, which was a neutral country, not participating in the war, and was offered, quote unquote, the position by Carl Zygmunt, a director of the Nobel Institute for Experimental Physics, and 1924 Nobel Prize winner. What does it mean, offered the position? Zygmunt gave her a room in a basement for a laboratory, but didn't allocate any staff, equipment, or funds for research. And most importantly, no salary, not a penny. As Liz had anticipated, life had to start over, anew. Okay, I'm finishing basically. I'm already 4 minutes, 3 minutes late. I'm finishing. I have 2 transparency left. So now the saddest part of the story. So what happened after they met in November in Copenhagen? A month or 6 weeks later, Otto Hahn sent a paper that they sent a paper to the Nature journal in England, the major journal at that time, that he and Strassman found lighter elements in the products of irradiation of uranium by neutrons. Lies was not among the authors, not even mentioned. And he also published a more detailed article in January 1939 in the German journal Naturwissenschaften, reporting the discovery of barium. Barium is significantly lighter than uranium after irradiation. As I said, Lies was not mentioned, although this was only the last step in many years of joint work. And moreover, even this work they designed together, and she couldn't participate only because she couldn't be in Germany. It was mortally dangerous for her. Hahn later stated that even he included Meitner in the list of the authors, she would have been thrown out in the editorial office anyway because of her Jewish origin. So to end the story, what should I say? In 1944, Otto Hahn was awarded the Nobel Prize for this discovery. Just Otto Hahn, not his assistant and no Lise Meitner. The scientific community was appalled. The stars of the scientific community, such as Max Bohr, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, wrote a letter to the Nobel Committee, very angry letters, but nothing helped. What happened more closely, you see, literally in a week or even less than a week, when Liz was in Sweden, she was visited by her nephew Otto Frisch, which at that time found a refuge in the United Kingdom. And the first day they went to ski in a snowy forest and started a conversation. And I will skip this part because of the lack of time. What I should say, they were the first to figure out that what actually happened was the fission of the uranium. Otto Hahn was a pure experimenter. He had no physical picture behind what he was doing, and he could not have done this. And this was the beginning of the nuclear bomb. You know, Otto Frisch returned to the United Kingdom, and shortly later, you see, in March 1940, and a year later, he combined his efforts with Rudolf Peierls, who also was a refugee in the United Kingdom. And in a month or so, they worked out their famous Frisch-Peierls memorandum about the possibility of the nuclear weapon. The situation in the United Kingdom was desperate, and Churchill was happy to believe in this miracle. That's how the nuclear project started. Okay, basically I have to finish. The only thing I don't know, you see, just a few remaining words about Lise Meitner. I believe she was treated extremely unfairly. And not only because she was Jewish, but she was treated unfairly because she was a woman and people didn't, and she was a genius in physics and chemistry, physical chemistry, and nobody recognized it till now. Basically, now there is a whole number of prizes of her name, fellowships for young physicists in Austria, you know, in Germany, some medals. But she's dead since 1968. How many years had to pass in order people would recognize that he was a great chemical physicist? That's what she wrote. That's what she wrote to Hahn in a letter which he claimed he never received it. It was not only stupid, but very wrong that I didn't leave at once in 1933. You all worked for Nazi Germany, and you didn't even try passive resistance. One should take a man like Heisenberg and millions like him and force them to look at these camps and the martyred people. Eventually, they made amends. You know, Otto Hahn was not a malicious Nazi person, but okay, he was a man of opportunity. He saw the opportunity, he grabbed it, and that's all. But I can understand that he had bad feelings. Eventually, they returned to their friendship. Of course, it was not as tight as in the first 31 years of their cooperation and work together. Lise Meitner, after she retired, well, also Sweden was also not a heaven to her, you know, she was not paid for a long time. And I can read, you know, why she didn't get a Nobel Prize. In 50 years after that, you know, Nobel archives are open in 50 years. And there was a journalist, either American or English, I don't know, who looked into these archives, Ruth Syme, carefully. And she published, made a few publications. And what she wrote after studying the archives, that in Sweden there was no general sympathy for refugees from Nazi Germany, and its academic culture had always been firmly pro-German. It appears that Lise Meitner didn't share the prize because the structure of the Nobel Committee was ill-suited to assess interdisciplinary work, because the members of the chemistry committee were unable or unwilling to judge her contribution fairly, and because the war in Sweden, scientists relied on their own limited expertise. Meitner's exclusion from chemistry award may well be summarized as a mixture of disciplinary bias, political obtuseness, ignorance, and haste. By the way, she was nominated for Nobel Prize again and again. 19 plus 29, 19 for Nobel Prize in Physics, 29 times for Nobel Prize in Chemistry, but she never won it. Thank you very much. Sorry for a short delay. I have many other things to say, but okay, enough is enough. If you have any questions, please ask questions.
Thank you, Misha.
Thank you, Misha. Very educating.
Thank you.
Please ask questions. I mean, I don't think we need.
Dmitry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question and a sort of a comment. So the question is, there are claims that Sigmund was actually against Lise Meitner's Nobel Prize, so he opposed it. Is that true?
Yeah, he was a member of the Chemistry Nobel Prize Committee. Well, I don't know. I didn't see the file. I mean, I know what Ruth Syme wrote and published, but that's a fact that he was a member of the Nobel Prize Committee, and by the fact how she was welcomed by him shows that he really didn't like her personally, I believe, not as a scientist. Maybe she didn't understood the significance, the impact of what she was doing, but you know, what he offered to her in her position, you know, such an experienced person with so many important, crucial publications, to offer a room without any support, a room in the basement with no financial support, no salary. How do you think? What's that?
You mentioned that she was only the second student, female student
Yeah.
to enter a PhD program in Vienna. How did that come about? What sort of helped her actually get admitted and so on?
You see, that's just the rules changed. You see, she was born in 1978. The University of Vienna didn't accept female students until 1900. And apparently in 1900, they accepted only one woman. So she was the first woman who legally was accepted. She was a very bright student at school, you know. She was amazed about physics. She was very well prepared to do research, and it's not that they accepted her to the university because she was a pretty girl, but because she deserved it. But before 1900, it was not possible, which was a common practice at that time. You know, it's not that Austria was especially retarded. You know, many European, there were very few who started accepting female students in 1890. Very few, maybe 2 or 3 in the continent. More question, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to sneak in that comment I didn't mention. So apparently, I think an important story, you probably would have mentioned it, but that Fritz Strassmann ended up as a member of Yad Vashem. So he stayed in the occupied territory, but he was covering Jewish people in his place during the war. So he became the member of Yad Vashem Institute in Israel.
Yeah. No, I didn't know this. Thank you. I know about some other cases as well. Many physicists tried, I mean, take for instance, Max Planck. You see, Max Planck was the beginner, the founding father of quantum mechanics. He himself was not Jewish. He was pure Aryan, and moreover, the first years in the first years, he was very much in favor of Hitler, you know, because after Hitler, within a year, completely dealt with unemployment, he just started what Hitler did, basically the same as Roosevelt did in the United States towards the end of the Great Depression. He started building roads, first-rate, high-quality roads, and this attracted very many workers who lost any job, and they were happy for getting any job, you know. So they joined the army of road builders, and then, of course, he started militarization of the country, and so military production skyrocketed, and this also needed working hands, you know. So this huge unemployment and the galloping inflation, which characterized Germany before Hitler's advent to power, was dealt with within a year. And Max Planck, who liked Germany as his motherland, as a strong country, as the center of the world science, he sympathized for the first year of TUSIS. He sympathized with Hitler, but eventually he once even had a conversation with Hitler. When he starts seeing that, you know, Jewish and politically leftist people were expelled from academia, and because he was so famous, he had an opportunity to talk to Hitler and started you know, trying to persuade him not to do these stupid things. He was insisting that this will ruin German science completely. You know, if continued for a short while, it will ruin German science and the German superiority will disappear. But Hitler apparently was too stupid or too stubborn. And after that, Planck started, you know, helping at least his students, you know, his students, his assistants who had to leave Germany. He started helping them as hard as he can, helping them to find positions in the UK or the US. So he did good deeds too, although he never said anything, you know, in protest against the regime. But what he disliked, later on, he really hated Hitler, you know, and if you read his writings of a later time, his motive, his you know, constant perennial statement was, this guy leads the Germany to a total disaster. What he does will bring it to nothing. The great power, the great European power, or maybe the world power, is going to a catastrophe, which was true, of course, but it was in private, you know, correspondence. But now it is published, you can read. So he was right, and he hated Hitler, but officially he never protested or wrote a letter because he believed it's useless, which maybe that's true, maybe that's useless. I mean, who am I to judge him on that?
Are there other questions for Misha?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question actually. Thank you so much for a really captivating talk. I was curious if you had any particular you know, books or documentaries or anything that you would in particular recommend to learn more about some of these people in this period. I was particularly fascinated by the stuff about Lise Meitner. I'd known a little bit about her work and her life, but that section was especially fascinating. So any resources to dig more, I'd love to hear them.
You see, well, as I said, for many years, she was in a relative oblivion. Even if you looked 10 years ago, when I started being interested in her life and career, at that time, even the Wikipedia article item on Lise Meitner was like 2 paragraphs. Now it's significantly expanded, but I haven't seen any real book written by a professional, you know, historian. There are many articles in the literature. Is there a book? What's the name of the book? Yeah, I see. I see the book shown.
The Age of Innocence by, I can't make out the author's name. Roger.
The Age of.
Okay.
Roger, you're muted. Do you want to unmute? I'm trying to unmute him. I'm just.
But I think this book is not only about, it's not exclusively about Lise Meitner, right?
It looks like it's about nuclear physics between the wars in general.
Yeah, in general. So it includes many essays probably on other things, but I haven't seen any specifically devoted to Lise Meitner book. Many articles exist in the literature. So I read some of them. I don't know what else to say. We don't hear. Jenny.
Yes, I'm here.
No, but Roger tries to say something.
Yeah, I know he's muted and I can't unmute him. He'll have to unmute himself. I can mute people, but I can't unmute them.
Okay.
I'm going to put the book in the chat. I have the name of it and the link on Amazon. It's written by Roger.
Yeah.
By the way.
Okay.
So
yeah, it would be.
I'll put that in the chat.
Okay.
It's an Amazon link, so forgive me for supporting the great evil of Amazon.
Yeah.
But there we go. Okay, so there, it's in the chat for you guys.
No, by the way, a little bit, if you are interested, where it is? Okay, just to finish with answering these questions, I wrote a book about the creation of the nuclear bomb, and there is a chapter there devoted to Liz Meitner. And I have a few free copies on spare. No, I have one for myself, but I don't need more than one. So if somebody is interested, but it's not about Liz, exclusively about Liz Meitner. It's about Piers, about his friends and colleagues, and about other people who eventually came to. By the way, there is a book, it's called Hitler's Gift. Hitler's Gift. It's written by some, I believe, British author. I have it somewhere here. And it's about refugees from Germany who came to England or the United States and won the Nobel Prize after they became refugees. You know, he described about 20 of them and their stories. It's kind of an interesting book. So this he considered, or yeah, it's a man. He considered them as a gift of Hitler to the Western civilization.
I put the link to that book, Hitler's Gift, in the chat as well.
Okay.
Are
It's
there other
quite interesting.
questions?
You see, this is a book of more like a historian, so it doesn't have that many funny stories, but at least it has information. And that's remarkable. Yeah, they're mostly physicists, you know, like Bethe, for instance, or about Fermi, by the way, who got a Nobel Prize for erroneous experiments, right? It was, for his family, it was a great thing because he got stuck in Italy. Italy was a fascist country too. He had no permission to leave the country. And his wife, Laura in American pronunciation, she was Jewish. So he expected that when German comes, you know what would happen or what might happen. He wanted to leave the country but he was not allowed to leave the country. And fortunately, in 1938, when he got the Nobel Prize, he wrote a petition to Mussolini to let him go to Sweden to get the Nobel Prize.
Wait, I guess my son, Marcus, has figured out how to unmute me.
Okay.
So this book, I published this. The title is The Age of Innocence, Nuclear Physics Between the First and Second World Wars. And it discusses very much what you discussed today, Misha. And I appreciated your talk very much. But this book treats essentially all of the topics that you discussed today, and so it's always tough for me to recommend my own stuff, but this book does go into it in a considerable detail. Lisa Meitner from Heisenberg's model of the neutron, etc. So there's a lot in this book, and it's been very well received by the historical and also the physics community, by those that there have been a number of reviews too by physicists who have appreciated it very much. Anyway, here it is, The Age of Innocence, Nuclear Physics Between the First and Second World Wars.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I think I never spend time, you know, people are probably tired, so maybe we should stop. What do you mean, Martin? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful seminar and a continuation of your colloquium, Nisha.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Yep.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, thank you.